Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're checking out the GeForce GTX 1050, the new 3GB version. And boy, is this one a bit of a strange animal. Recently we checked out another strange graphics card, though that one was much more of a disaster than this one is, and that was the DDR4 version of the GT 1030, a horribly misleading product that really shouldn't exist, at least not as a GT 1030. That one will hopefully go down as the worst graphics card released in history. I say hopefully because, well, I hope we don't get another graphics card as terrible as the DDR4 GT 1030. But anyway, let's move on to this guy. So hopefully the 3GB version of the GTX 1050 isn't going to be nearly as bad. In fact, it may not be bad at all. There's a good chance it won't be looking at the specs, but even so, it's definitely not a GTX 1050, so a bit unnecessary and, well, a bit misleading there from Nvidia. Prior to May 2016, there was only one version of the GTX 1050, codenamed GP107-300, and it came with a 2GB memory buffer, not 3. However, in May, Nvidia quietly updated their GeForce GTX 1050 page on their website to include a 3GB model that looked to slot in between the existing 2GB 1050 and 4GB 1050 Ti, though it is a little bit more complicated than that. The 3GB 1050 isn't merely a 1050 with an extra gigabyte of VRAM. Instead, it features 768 CUDA cores on a smaller 96-bit wide memory bus, and this is due to a change in the back-end configuration. Okay, so it has 768 CUDA cores, it's a GTX 1050 Ti with 1GB less VRAM. Well, actually, no, it's not that either. In this table, you can see that while it has the same CUDA core count as the 1050 Ti, it has 25% less ROPS, and that means it has 25% less than the original 1050 as well. Although you do get the same 7GB per second GDDR5 memory, the memory bus has now been reduced to 96-bit wide, and that's due to the reduction in ROPS, which sees one of the 4 memory controllers disabled. The result is just 84GB per second of memory bandwidth, down from the 112GB per second of the 2GB 1050 and 4GB 1050 Ti. Additionally, this also means that the L2 cache capacity has been reduced down from 1MB to 768 kilobytes. Nvidia is clocking the cores higher to compensate here, but we expect that in some cases this won't help overcome the 25% reduction in memory bandwidth, ROPS, and cache. So, why is Nvidia selling a 3GB version of a GTX 1050 that likely won't perform like a 1050 with an extra gigabyte of VRAM? Given the specifications, we expect that for the most part it will sit between the 2GB 1050 and 1050 Ti, but there is no doubt going to be a few instances where it'll actually be slower than even the 2GB 1050. The most likely reason being that they had a stockpile of defective GP107 dies that had a faulty memory controller, for example, so Nvidia is just salvaging those parts by creating the 3GB 1050. It's a bit odd to see this so late in the product cycle, but that's not really the issue here. Once again, the issue is we're seeing multiple different GPU configurations under the one name. It's my opinion that at the very least, this thing should have been called the GTX 1050 SE or LE or pretty much anything other than the 1050 3GB. Regardless of the performance, this is still very misleading to the consumer, and it's really not unlike the 3GB and 6GB GTX 1060 situation, and really I'm expecting to find a similar result. Speaking of which, on hand for testing, if you haven't noticed, I do have the EVGA GeForce GTX 1050 SC Gaming. It comes with a small 5% factory overclock, and right now is selling for $140 US, which is basically what you can expect to pay for a GTX 1050 2GB model. And that makes it about, I think it's about $30 US cheaper than the cheapest GTX 1050 Ti's at the moment. So for testing, we have 23 games in total, all of which have been tested at 1080p using various quality settings. However, I will only be discussing the results for 8 of the games, and then I'll be jumping into our usual performance breakdown. The rest of the graphs will be available for free on our Patreon page, and the link will be in the video description. Then finally, as usual, our Corsair GPU test rig built inside the Crystal Series 570X has been used, and inside we have a Core i7-8700K clocked at 5GHz with 32GB of DDR4 3200 memory. I realize this hardware configuration is overkill for these entry-level GPUs. The idea here though is to remove any potential system bottlenecks that may mask GPU performance, plus it also allows me to use these results and compare them to higher end cards that have been tested using the same quality settings. Okay, so I think that's about everything. Let's get to the good stuff. Starting with the Battlefield 1 results, we see that the 3GB 1050 is 9% faster than the 2GB version, but 16% slower than the 1050 Ti. So that's actually a really great result for the 3GB version, as it is indeed faster than the original 1050 in this title. That said, it is still quite a bit slower than the 1050 Ti due to the downgrades I spoke of earlier. Despite the positive performance just seen, when testing with Wreckfest we find a completely different picture. Here the 3GB 1050 was actually slower than the original 1050, 13% slower in fact, and that meant it was 21% slower than the 1050 Ti. So that is a troubling result there in Wreckfest, but let's move on and see what we find in Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege. Here we see that the 3GB 1050 is 22% faster than the original 2GB model and just 11% slower than the 1050 Ti. So, like Battlefield 1, this is a very good result for the 3GB model. Moving on, we have Far Cry 5, and we're certainly starting to see some mixed results here. This time the 3GB 1050 was a few frames slower than the 2GB model, making it 5% slower. This also meant it was 15% slower than the 1050 Ti. Then we have some testing with Fortnite, and this shows similar performance between the 2GB and 3GB 1050 models, making them both only slightly slower than the 1050 Ti. We also see comparable performance when testing with Total War Saga Thrones of Britannia. Here the 3GB model was 3% faster than the original 2GB version. Interestingly, when playing with Arma 3, we see an 11% reduction in performance for the 3GB 1050 when compared to the 2GB version, and the result for the 1% low also dropped below 60 FPS. So this is another poor result for the 3GB model. Finally, we're going to look at the Warhammer Vermintide 2 results, and here we see a tie between the 2 and 3GB versions of the 1050, and this made them both 13% slower than the 1050 Ti. Wrapping things up, when it comes to power consumption, the 3GB 1050 was comparable to the original 1050, only pushing total system consumption about 5% higher. Okay, so from that small 8-game sample, we saw some pretty mixed results, it has to be said. I do have 23 games though, so let's look at all 23 and see how the results varied across all those games. So here are the results for all 23 games, and you've no doubt been drawn to the Wolfenstein result, which saw the 3GB model delivering 65% more performance. This is definitely an outlier result, and it's due to the 2GB VRAM buffer of the original 1050 just being overwhelmed by the maximum in-game quality settings. However, because the 3GB model did average over 50 FPS and produced a 1% low result of 48 FPS, I didn't feel the need to reduce the quality settings just to accommodate the 2GB version. Still, this is a very rare case. You're not going to see too many games producing these kinds of margins at 1080p, so let's just remove that result and take a look at this again. Okay, so this looks a bit more normal, and now Rainbow Six Siege is our outlier, but this outlier isn't nearly as extreme as the one seen previously. Overall, the 3GB model was 4% faster on average, but it was still slower in 5 of the games tested, 4 of which it was slower by a 5% or greater margin. We also saw a tie in 3 titles, and then the 3GB GTX 1050 was faster by a 5% or greater margin in 10 of the 23 games tested, so certainly not a bad result. The 3GB version of the GTX 1050 is a bit of an odd product for a number of reasons. Nvidia say that it is around 10% faster than the 2GB version, and we found on average it was 4% faster, but there are certainly instances where you could say it's up to 10% faster, but I wouldn't say gamers should expect to see a 10% performance uplift. Either way though, for the most part it was faster than the 2GB GTX 1050, and as far as I can tell, pricing's pretty much the same, at least it is for the EVGA version that we tested. This 3GB version of the GP107 architecture is a good example of how important the memory subsystem is and how much of an influence it can have on performance under certain conditions. In some instances, the bandwidth, ROP throughput, and reduction of cache capacity had little impact when compared to the 1050 Ti, but in some the performance hit was massive. For those reasons, simply naming this product the GTX 1050 3GB isn't good enough in my opinion. Thankfully though, this isn't another GT 1030 DDR4 situation, as the 3GB model is arguably better value than the original 2GB version, but still there is some risk of misleading consumers here. It's hard to say exactly why Nvidia has released this product, especially being that it's so late in the game. That said, this release did happen during the cryptocurrency mining boom, and with the GTX 1050 Ti being a popular choice amongst miners, perhaps this was a way of boosting stock levels by selling defective GPUs. If you're desperate for a new graphics card and you have around $100 to $150 US to spend, then the 3GB 1050 is one of the best options available right now. Personally though, I would certainly recommend that you hold off buying a new graphics card at this point if you can. We do have new graphics cards incoming very soon, so yeah, just keep that in mind. Hopefully though, we will see the 3GB and the 2GB models creeping down to the $110 US MSRP in the coming weeks, so for those of you that are super desperate for a new graphics card, can just get one, because after all, the new graphics cards will likely see sort of the almost flagship product come in, and then they'll trickle down months later. So it might be anywhere from 4 to 6 months after the initial next gen product release that you get sort of a 1050 equivalent, $100 to $150 US graphics card. And that is going to do it for this one. Another benchmark video done. So hopefully it was a success. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, you know what to do. There's that little thumb up thing. You hit that one if you feel like it wasn't very good, but you know, it was worth this, surely. Come on. Yeah. If you want to see more content like this, you know what to do. There's that red thing. You hit that. That subscribes you. Sometimes you'll be notified. Most of the time you won't be. That's how it seems to work for our channel. And if you really appreciate what we do, you can give us money by supporting us on Patreon, and we use that to buy products just like this one. We bought this with our own money. And yeah, that's going to do it for this one. Thanks for watching. I'm your host, Steve. See you next time.